October 14th, 1863, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The gas lamps flicker low in the marble hall of the American Philosophical Society as a silence thicker than fog settles over the assembly of white men in black coats. They have gathered not to witness history but to dissect it. At the center of the room, beneath the cold gaze of portraits depicting founding fathers and scientific pioneers, sits a girl of no more than 12 years. Her name is Eliza Davis, her skin the color of polished mahogany, her eyes holding galaxies they refuse to name. She does not tremble. She does not beg. She simply exists, brilliant and unbreakable, in a world that has built its entire foundation on the lie that she should not be. This is not a story of discovery. This is a story of denial. Eliza Davis, born enslaved in the blood-soaked soil of Virginia, had taught herself Latin by age 7, solved mathematical theorems that baffled university professors by 9, and could recite entire philosophical texts in 3 languages by 11. When word of her brilliance reached the northern intellectual elite, they did not celebrate, they panicked. Because if one black girl could shatter every pseudoscientific doctrine of racial inferiority with nothing but her mind, then the entire empire of subjugation, the theology of supremacy, the economy of human bondage, it all crumbled like ash in her small, steady hands. Tonight they would try to break what they could not explain. Tonight they would measure her skull, test her memory, probe her genius, searching desperately for proof that she was anomaly, aberration, anything but evidence of their greatest lie. The air tastes of tobacco smoke and terror as Dr. Samuel Morton steps forward, calipers gleaming in the gaslight like instruments of inquisition. But before we watch them try to reduce infinity to inches, before we see how brilliance becomes a battlefield and a child becomes a weapon against her own liberation, pause here, in this breath between myth and memory. If you believe that some minds are born to rewrite the world, that intelligence is the most dangerous rebellion, that one girl's genius can indict an entire civilization, then stay with us. Subscribe to Bear Witness. Comment below with the name of someone history tried to erase. Because what happens next in that room will echo across centuries, and Eliza Davis deserves more than silence. She deserves to be remembered as the storm that made science itself confess. Eliza Davis was born in the winter of 1851 on the Thornhill plantation in Goochland County, Virginia, where the frost came late and the cotton grew sparse. Her mother, Ruth, worked in the main house, scrubbing floors, starching linens, moving like a ghost through rooms filled with books she was forbidden to touch. Her father's name was never spoken aloud. Some said he was a preacher who passed through in the summer. Others whispered he was the master's son. But Ruth kept that secret buried deep where no overseer's whip could reach it. What mattered was this. Eliza came into the world during a lunar eclipse, and the midwife, an old woman named Amma who remembered Africa, said the child's eyes opened too soon, too knowing, as if she had been here before. By age 3, Eliza was arranging stones in patterns that mimicked constellations. By 4, she had memorized every hymn sung in the slave quarters and could recite them backwards. By 5, she had taught herself to read by watching the master's children through the window of their tutoring room, her small face pressed against the cold glass, her mind devouring every letter, every word, every forbidden doorway, into worlds she was told she had no right to enter. The master's wife, a brittle woman named Caroline Thornhill, discovered Eliza one afternoon in the library, a copy of Virgil's Aeneid open in her lap, her lips moving silently through Latin verses. Caroline did not rage. She went pale as if she had seen a ghost and walked out without a word. 2 days later, Ruth was sold south to a cotton plantation in Georgia. The message was clear. Brilliance had a price, and it would always be paid in blood. Eliza never saw her mother again. But she did not stop reading. She could not. Because even at 6 years old, even with her heart shattered and her world dismantled, Eliza understood something the Thornhills never would. That knowledge was the only country where she could never be enslaved. The years that followed were a study in survival disguised as obedience. Eliza learned to hide her brilliance the way other children hid stolen bread, carefully, quietly in the shadows where masters did not think to look. She worked in the kitchens alongside the other enslaved children, peeling potatoes and plucking chickens, her hands moving through the motions while her mind wandered through theorems and conjugations. At night, when the plantation slept beneath a quilt of stars, she would slip into the barn where the old stable hand, a man named Josiah who had lost his tongue to a slaver's blade years before, kept a hidden collection of discarded newspapers and torn book pages he had salvaged from the main house trash. Josiah could not read, but he understood the hunger in Eliza's eyes, and he became her silent guardian, her keeper of contraband knowledge. By candlelight stolen from the kitchen stores, Eliza consumed everything: agricultural reports, political essays, fragments of scientific journals, even the society pages that detailed the lives of people who would never acknowledge her humanity. She taught herself mathematics by calculating crop yields and seasons. She learned geography by studying the routes of the Underground Railroad whispered about in the quarters. She mastered Greek by deciphering the inscriptions on the family mausoleum during the rare moments she was sent to place flowers on graves of people who had owned her ancestors. By age 9, Eliza had surpassed the education of most university men, yet she wore her ignorance like armor in front of the Thornhills, speaking only in the broken dialect they expected, moving with the slowness they mistook for stupidity. But the mind, once awakened, cannot be chained, and Eliza's mind was a cathedral, vast, sacred, and utterly ungovernable. It was this duality, this performance of diminishment while harboring galaxies, that would eventually save her life and doom her to a different kind of captivity. Because brilliance in a black child was not a gift to be nurtured in 1860s America, it was a threat to be neutralized, an anomaly to be explained away, or failing that, destroyed. Everything changed in the autumn of 1862 when Reverend Thomas Ashford arrived at the Thornhill plantation. He was a Massachusetts abolitionist, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, and the kind of righteous fury that burned slow and deliberate like a coal mine fire. He had come south under the pretense of missionary work, preaching to the enslaved populations about salvation and patience, but his true mission was cartography, mapping routes, identifying safe houses, memorizing faces of those who might risk the journey north. During one of his Sunday sermons in the slave quarters, Eliza sat in the back row silent as always, but when Reverend Ashford quoted scripture in Latin, her lips moved in perfect synchronization with his words. He noticed. After the service, he approached her with a casual question, asking in Latin if she understood what he had said. Eliza, forgetting for one fatal moment to perform her expected ignorance, responded fluently, correcting a grammatical error he had made in his conjugation. The Reverend's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, wonder, and finally a grim determination. He spent the next 3 weeks observing Eliza from a distance, testing her subtly with scraps of French, fragments of mathematical problems scratched in the dirt, references to philosophers and poets. Each time, Eliza revealed another layer of her impossible genius. Finally, Reverend Ashford made a decision that would alter the trajectory of her life forever. He approached Master Thornhill with a proposition. He would pay $300, a fortune for a child, especially one considered simple by the household, to purchase Eliza and bring her north for Christian education and domestic service. Thornhill, eager for the money and glad to be rid of a girl who had grown unsettling in her silence, agreed without hesitation. Papers were signed, money exchanged hands. And on a gray November morning, Eliza Davis walked off the Thornhill plantation for the last time, carrying nothing but the clothes on her back and a mind vast enough to terrify a nation. She did not look back. There was nothing behind her but ghosts. The journey north was a passage through America's split soul, a nation tearing itself apart over the question of whether people like Eliza were fully human. They traveled by train and wagon, through Pennsylvania towns where church bells rang for Union soldiers, and widows wore black veils like flags of grief. Reverend Ashford did not treat Eliza as property, He spoke to her as an equal, which was perhaps more disorienting than any cruelty she had known. On the third night, camped in a Quaker safe house outside of Baltimore, he asked her a question that had been haunting him since the plantation. "Child, how did you come to know so much?" Eliza stared into the fireplace, watching flames consume logs the way knowledge had consumed her childhood, and answered with a truth she had never spoken aloud. "I learned because forgetting would have been death, Reverend. Not the death of the body, that comes for all of us, but the death of the self. They could own my hours, my labor, my very breath. But my mind was a country they could never conquer, so I filled it with everything they said I could not hold. Every theorem was a rebellion. Every Latin verse was a proclamation of war." Ashford sat in stunned silence, recognizing in her words a defiance more profound than any armed resistance. When they finally reached Philadelphia in early December, the city was a confusion of cobblestone streets and factory smoke, of abolitionist meeting halls and draft riots, of freed black communities living in tenuous liberty, and Irish immigrants who hated them for competing for the same scarce jobs. Ashford brought Eliza to his colleagues at the American Philosophical Society, men who fancied themselves progressive, who supported abolition in theory while maintaining comfortable distance from its reality. He presented her not as a curiosity, but as evidence, living, breathing proof that the scientific racism underpinning the entire slave system was a meticulously constructed lie. The philosophers were intrigued, but also deeply threatened, because if Eliza Davis was possible, then everything they had published, every measurement and theory justifying racial hierarchy, was not just wrong, it was weaponized fiction. And fiction, once exposed, has no power except the violence required to maintain it. Dr. Samuel George Morton was the high priest of American racial science, a Philadelphia physician whose collection of human skulls numbered over 1,000, each one carefully measured and catalogued in service of a singular obsession, proving that cranial capacity determined intelligence and that the Negro race possessed inherently inferior mental faculties. His 1839 treatise, Crania Americana, had become scripture for those who needed scientific language to sanctify their brutality. Morton was not a slaveholder himself. He considered himself above such crude economics, but his calipers and calculations had done more to justify the institution than 1,000 overseers' whips. He was a respected member of the Academy, a man whose lectures drew crowds, whose publications were cited in congressional debates over whether black soldiers should be armed, whether freed slaves should be educated, whether an entire people deserved the rights of citizenship. When Reverend Ashford requested a formal examination of Eliza Davis before the society, Morton saw an opportunity, not to discover truth, but to demonstrate the exception that proved his rule. He would test this allegedly brilliant Negro child, expose the exaggerations of abolitionist sentiment, and reaffirm the natural order with empirical precision. He agreed to the examination with the confidence of a man who had never been proven wrong because he controlled the instruments of measurement. But Morton had never encountered anyone like Eliza. On the morning of October 14, 1863, he arrived at the Society's hall early, arranging his tools with ritualistic care, the calipers for measuring skull dimensions, the written examinations in Latin and Greek, the mathematical problems designed to challenge university students, the memory tests that required recitation of complex texts after a single reading. He had invited colleagues, journalists, even a sketch artist from Harper's Weekly to document what he assumed would be a validation of his life's work. The room filled with the scent of pipe tobacco and the murmur of confident men. They were there to witness science. What they would actually witness was the beginning of its unraveling, performed by a 12-year-old girl who had been forbidden to exist. Eliza entered the hall wearing a simple gray dress that Reverend Ashford's wife had sewn for her, her hair braided and pinned in a style that made her look even younger than her 12 years. She moved through the gauntlet of staring white faces with a composure that unnerved them. No shuffling, no downcast eyes, no performance of the subservience they expected. She walked like someone who had already survived worse than their judgment. Morton gestured to a chair positioned at the center of the room beneath a chandelier that cast theatrical shadows across the marble floor. "Sit, child," he said, his voice carrying the false kindness of a vivisectionist addressing a laboratory animal. Eliza sat. The room fell silent except for the scratch of the artist's pencil and the distant sound of carriage wheels on cobblestone streets outside. Morton began with the physical examination, producing his calipers with a flourish. "I will now measure the cranial dimensions to establish baseline data," he announced to the assembled witnesses, as if Eliza were not present, as if she could not understand that he was attempting to reduce her humanity to millimeters and angles. He placed the cold metal against her skull, measuring the distance from brow to crown, from temple to temple, recording numbers in a leather-bound journal with the solemnity of sacred ritual. Eliza did not flinch. She had learned long ago that stillness was a form of resistance, that refusing to give them the reaction they wanted was its own quiet violence. When Morton finished his measurements, he frowned, a small crack in his professional composure. Her cranial capacity fell well within the range he had established for superior specimens, undermining his first assumption. But measurements could be anomalies, he told himself. The true test would be intellectual capacity. He produced the first examination paper, written entirely in Latin, containing passages from Cicero and questions about rhetoric and philosophy. "You may begin," he said, placing it before her with the certainty of a man setting a trap. Eliza picked up the pen, read the entire page in less than a minute, and began writing her responses in a script so elegant it looked like calligraphy. The scratch of Eliza's pen was the only sound in the hall for the next 20 minutes. Morton paced behind her, occasionally glancing over her shoulder, his expression shifting from confidence to confusion to something approaching alarm. She was not merely answering the questions, she was dissecting them, identifying the philosophical frameworks underlying each prompt and responding with references to texts Morton himself had only superficially studied. When she finished the Latin examination, she set down the pen and looked up at him with eyes that held no challenge, no pride, only a quiet certainty that made his hands tremble slightly as he took the papers. He read her responses in silence while the assembled witnesses shifted in their seats, coughing and murmuring. Every answer was flawless. More than flawless, they demonstrated a depth of comprehension that most classical scholars would require decades to achieve. Morton's jaw tightened. He produced the second examination, this one in ancient Greek, containing passages from Plato's Republic and questions about political philosophy and ethics. Surely this would expose the limits of her knowledge. Greek was far less common than Latin, even among educated whites. Eliza completed it in 15 minutes, and when Morton reviewed her work, he found she had not only answered every question correctly, but had also noted a transcription error in his own text, correcting a verb tense that had been mistakenly copied. A few of the witnesses leaned forward now, their curiosity overcoming their prejudice. One man, a professor from the University of Pennsylvania, whispered audibly, "Extraordinary." Morton shot him a silencing glare. The mathematical examination came next. Algebraic equations, geometric proofs, problems in calculus that would challenge any university student. Morton placed them before Eliza with barely concealed desperation, as if the numbers themselves might succeed where languages had failed. She solved them all without hesitation, her calculations precise and elegant, showing her work with the clarity of a teacher instructing pupils. By the time she finished, Morton's face had gone pale, and a thin film of sweat glistened on his forehead despite the cool October air. His life's work was dissolving before his eyes, one perfect answer at a time. Desperation makes monsters of even civilized men. Morton, watching his theories crumble like ancient parchment, turned to the one test he believed could not be falsified, the memory examination. He produced a dense philosophical text, 20 pages from Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, written in the original German, a language he had no record of Eliza ever encountering. "I will give you 30 minutes to read this," he announced. his voice regaining some of its authority. Then I will require you to recite passages and answer questions about the content. It was an impossible task. Even trained scholars would struggle to absorb and retain such complex material in a single reading, especially in a foreign language. But Morton was no longer interested in fair assessment. He was fighting for survival, for the preservation of a world view that gave meaning to his existence and power to his people. Eliza took the pages without comment. The room watched as she read, her eyes moving across the German text with steady rhythm, her face revealing nothing. Some witnesses checked their pocket watches, counting down the minutes. Others whispered theories. Perhaps she had been coached. Perhaps she had photographic memory but no real comprehension. Perhaps this was all an elaborate abolitionist hoax. After exactly 23 minutes, Eliza looked up and said in perfect, unaccented German, "I am finished." Morton blinked. "You understand German?" "I do now," she replied, still in German. The grammar is similar to Latin in structure, and the philosophical vocabulary follows logical patterns. "May I have water?" "My throat is dry." Someone brought her a glass. She drank slowly while Morton gathered himself, formulating questions designed to probe whether she had truly comprehended the notoriously difficult Kantian concepts of transcendental idealism and synthetic a priori knowledge. For the next hour, he interrogated her like a hostile prosecutor, and for the next hour she answered with the precision of someone who had not merely read Kant but had wrestled with his ideas and emerged with understanding. She quoted passages verbatim, explained concepts in her own words, even identified sections where she disagreed with the philosopher's conclusions, offering counterarguments that demonstrated independent critical thought. The room had gone from skeptical to silent to something approaching awe and terror. By the time the examination concluded, the afternoon sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the marble hall like prison bars made of light. Morton stood before his colleagues, holding Eliza's test papers as if they were contaminated with plague, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. He had come to prove Negro intellectual inferiority and had instead produced irrefutable evidence of genius that his entire theoretical framework could not explain. The other witnesses were divided. Some leaned forward with genuine fascination, reconsidering beliefs they had held as unquestionable truth. Others sat rigid with arms crossed, their faces hardening with resentment, because if they accepted what they had just witnessed, they would have to accept culpability for centuries of atrocity. Reverend Ashford stood in the corner, vindicated but not celebratory, because he understood that Eliza's brilliance had just made her more dangerous to the existing order, not less. Dr. Morton cleared his throat and addressed the assembly with the careful diction of a man constructing a defense for a position that had already lost. "Gentlemen," he began, "what we have witnessed today is indeed remarkable. However, we must resist the temptation to draw sweeping conclusions from a single case. This child may represent a statistical anomaly, a deviation from the norm that actually reinforces the general rule of racial capacity. Just as one may find an exceptionally tall member of a typically short population, so too may one encounter isolated instances of elevated intellect within a generally inferior race. It was intellectual cowardice dressed in scientific language, and everyone in the room knew it. But it gave them permission to dismiss what they had seen, to preserve their comfortable hierarchies, to continue justifying the unjustifiable. One voice cut through the murmurs of agreement, the University of Pennsylvania professor who had whispered earlier, "Or perhaps, Dr. Morton, what we have witnessed is evidence that your measurements and theories have been serving ideology rather than truth. Perhaps this child is not the anomaly. Perhaps our entire understanding is the aberration." The room erupted in argument, voices rising and overlapping, men standing and gesturing, while at the center of it all, Eliza Davis sat perfectly still, watching them fight over the meaning of her existence. The debate raged for another hour, voices echoing off the vaulted ceiling like thunder trapped in a stone cathedral. Accusations of abolitionist conspiracy clashed against calls for intellectual honesty. Dr. Morton, his reputation hemorrhaging with every passing minute, made increasingly desperate appeals to authority and precedent, citing his own publications as if repetition could resurrect credibility. But the fissure had opened, and doubt, that most dangerous of intellectual viruses, had infected the room. Finally, the president of the society, a silver-haired man named Dr. William Hartwell, raised his hand for silence. "Gentlemen, we are scholars, not politicians. What we have witnessed today presents a significant challenge to existing theories, and the proper response is not immediate acceptance or rejection, but further study. I propose we invite Miss Davis to return for additional examinations, that we might assemble a comprehensive report on this unusual case." It was a compromise that satisfied no one but allowed everyone to leave with dignity intact. Morton seized upon it as a lifeline, already planning more stringent tests, searching for the flaw that would restore his worldview. The progressive faction saw it as a first step toward dismantling scientific racism, and Reverend Ashford saw it for what it truly was, a postponement, not a resolution, a way for powerful men to avoid confronting uncomfortable truth. As the assembly dispersed into the autumn twilight, several members approached Eliza with a mixture of curiosity and condescension, speaking to her in the exaggerated tones reserved for children and foreigners, asking where she had really learned such things, implying that someone must have trained her, coached her, that genius could not spontaneously emerge from slave quarters and barn candlelight. Eliza answered their questions with patient precision, but her eyes had gone distant, as if she were calculating something far beyond their comprehension. She had spent 12 years learning to survive in a world that denied her humanity. Now she faced a different challenge, surviving in a world that acknowledged her brilliance but could not forgive her for possessing it. Because she had committed an unforgivable sin in 1863 America, she had been born black, brilliant, and utterly unbreakable, and for that they would never let her rest. The news of Eliza Davis spread through Philadelphia like fire through dry timber, sparking different reactions in different communities. In the black churches and freedmen's neighborhoods, her name became a whispered prayer, a sign that God had sent proof of their equal creation, that the lies told from pulpits and podiums and university lecterns were finally being exposed. Mothers pointed to her as evidence that their own children, given opportunity instead of oppression, could achieve anything. Frederick Douglass himself wrote about her in his newspaper, calling her a living refutation of slavocracy's most cherished delusion. But in the white establishment, her existence provoked a more sinister response. Newspapers in Baltimore and Richmond published editorials claiming she was a fraud, that abolitionists had found a clever Negro girl and spent years training her to perform like a circus animal. Pro-slavery physicians wrote papers suggesting that her intelligence was evidence of white ancestry, that perhaps her unknown father had been a master who elevated her blood. Others proposed she was a medical curiosity, a freak of nature whose brain had developed abnormally, making her no more representative of her race than a two-headed calf was representative of cattle. The most vicious attacks came from those who saw her as a weapon being wielded against Southern civilization. Editorials warned that abolitionists would use her as propaganda to justify arming Negro soldiers, educating freed slaves, perhaps even granting them citizenship and suffrage. "One exceptional Negro does not disprove the natural order," wrote a Charleston physician. "It merely proves that exceptions exist to test our faith in God's hierarchy." Meanwhile, Dr. Morton began assembling a new battery of tests, determined to find the hidden flaw, the evidence of coaching, the proof that would restore order to his collapsing universe. He wrote to colleagues in Boston and New York, requesting they send their most difficult examinations. He consulted with phrenologists and physiologists, searching for some physical explanation that would preserve racial hierarchy while acknowledging Eliza's abilities. And in quieter moments, alone in his study surrounded by his collection of skulls, he felt something he had never experienced before, the terrible suspicion that he had spent his entire career in service to a lie, that his measurements and calculations had been nothing more than mathematics in service to murder. Here, in this moment between recognition and reckoning, pause with us in the weight of what Eliza Davis represents. She is not merely a genius, she is a mirror held up to a nation's face, reflecting back the monstrous lie it has told itself to sleep peacefully while children are sold and families are shattered. Her brilliance is not extraordinary. It is evidence of how much greatness has been buried in unmarked graves, how many minds have been destroyed before they could speak, how many Elizas never got the chance to prove what she is proving now. If this story moves you, if her defiance against erasure stirs something in your soul, then subscribe to ensure her name outlives the men who tried to diminish it. Comment below with the word remember, because that is the only resistance that truly matters. Let us continue into the darkness she illuminated. The second examination was scheduled for November 30th, 1863, but Eliza Davis never appeared. 3 days before the appointed date, Reverend Ashford found her collapsed in his study, blood seeping from her nose, her body racked with convulsions that the physician who examined her could not explain through any medical framework he possessed. The diagnosis was vague and convenient. Brain fever, that catch-all term 19th century medicine applied to any neurological condition they could not understand. But those who knew Eliza suspected a darker truth, that the constant performance of her genius, the relentless scrutiny, the weight of representing an entire race's humanity to people determined to deny it, had fractured something essential inside her. She had survived slavery by hiding her light. Now she was dying from being forced to shine too bright for too long under hostile examination. For 3 weeks she lingered between consciousness and delirium, speaking sometimes in Latin, sometimes in languages no one recognized, her brilliant mind misfiring like an engine tearing itself apart. The physicians bled her, applied leeches, administered laudanum and mercury treatments that likely hastened her decline rather than healing it. Reverend Ashford sat vigil at her bedside, reading to her from books she had once devoured with such hunger, weeping at the injustice of a mind this vast being extinguished at 12 years old. In her lucid moments, Eliza did not express bitterness. She told Ashford that she had accomplished what she needed to accomplish. She had forced them to see, even if they chose blindness afterward. "They will spend generations trying to explain me away," she whispered, her voice thin as parchment. "But I existed. I proved it was possible. And somewhere another little girl in another slave quarter is teaching herself to read by candlelight, and my name will reach her as a promise that she is not alone, that her mind is not a curse, but a country they can never conquer." On December 23, 1863, as snow fell soft and silent over Philadelphia, Eliza Davis took her last breath. She was 12 years and 8 months old. The cause of death was listed as cerebral inflammation, but the truth was simpler and more brutal. America had killed her for daring to be undeniable. Dr. Samuel Morton attended Eliza's funeral, standing at the back of the small Negro church where Reverend Ashford delivered the eulogy. He did not speak to anyone. He did not explain his presence. He simply stood there in his black coat, holding his hat in trembling hands, staring at the small pine coffin that held the girl who had destroyed his life's meaning. Some said he came out of guilt. Others claimed he came to ensure she was truly dead, that the threat she represented was finally neutralized. But those who looked closely at his face saw something else entirely, the hollow eyes of a man who had glimpsed truth and could no longer unsee it, who would spend his remaining years haunted by the knowledge that he had built temples to a lie and baptized brutality in the language of science. Morton would die less than a year later in 1851, his collection of skulls donated to museums where they would continue whispering their false gospels for another century. The funeral itself was attended by hundreds, freed blacks and fugitive slaves, Quaker abolitionists and radical preachers, women in mourning clothes who had never met Eliza but understood she had died for all of them. Frederick Douglass sent a wreath with a card that read simply, "She proved we are." Reverend Ashford's eulogy was not gentle. He did not speak of God's mysterious plans or heaven's embrace. Instead, he indicted the nation itself, his voice rising like an Old Testament prophet calling down judgment. "This child was a miracle, and you murdered her," he thundered. Not with rope or rifle, but with the slow violence of scrutiny, with the crushing weight of having to prove her humanity every waking moment to people who had already decided she possessed none. You measured her skull and tested her memory and demanded she perform her brilliance like a trained animal. And when she exceeded every measure you created, you did not celebrate. You searched for ways to dismiss her. And now she is gone, and you will write in your journals that she was an anomaly, a statistical outlier, anything but what she actually was, evidence of your centuries-long crime against creation itself. In the years that followed, the establishment moved swiftly to bury Eliza Davis a second time, this time in the graveyard of historical memory. The American Philosophical Society's official records mentioned her examination only in passing, a footnote describing tests conducted on a Negro child of purported intellectual ability results inconclusive. Dr. Morton's colleagues quietly removed references to her from their correspondence, understanding that her existence complicated narratives they needed to keep simple. The sketch artist's drawings from that October day mysteriously disappeared from the archives of Harper's Weekly, lost to fire or theft or deliberate destruction. No one could say for certain. Textbooks on racial science published in the 1870s and 1880s made no mention of her, as if a 12-year-old girl who had mastered 5 languages and dismantled the intellectual foundations of white supremacy had never drawn breath. This erasure was not accidental, it was essential. Because Eliza Davis represented a possibility too dangerous to acknowledge, that genius was not the province of any single race, that brilliance bloomed wherever it found soil, and that centuries of subjugation had not been justified hierarchy but systematic destruction of human potential on a scale too massive to comprehend without existential horror. To remember Eliza honestly would require America to confront not just what it had done, but what it had lost. How many scientists and philosophers and artists had died in fields and auction blocks, how much collective human knowledge had been burned away in the name of profit and power. So they chose forgetting. But memory, like water, finds its way through cracks. In Black communities, Eliza's story survived as oral tradition, passed from grandmother to granddaughter, whispered in kitchens and Sunday schools, evolving into legend. Some versions said she had mastered 10 languages, others claimed she could solve any mathematical problem in seconds. A few insisted she had not died at all but escaped to Canada where she lived to old age, teaching generations of children that their minds were fortresses no oppressor could breach. The details changed, but the core remained constant. Once there was a girl so brilliant that even science had to confess, and they killed her for it, and we must never forget. It would take more than a century for historians to begin excavating Eliza's story from the deliberate rubble of forgetting. In the 1960s, a graduate student researching abolitionist networks stumbled upon Reverend Ashford's personal journals in a church basement in Massachusetts, and there, in fading ink, found detailed accounts of Eliza's examinations, her conversations, her final days. Other documents slowly surfaced, letters between society members debating what to do about the Davis problem, newspaper clippings from Black-owned publications that white archives had never bothered to collect, even a single photograph, damaged and nearly illegible, showing a young girl in a gray dress standing beside Reverend Ashford, her eyes staring directly into the camera with an intensity that transcended time. Scholars began piecing together what had been intentionally shattered, and with each recovered fragment, the magnitude of the erasure became clearer. Eliza Davis had not been forgotten by accident. She had been disappeared by design, excised from the historical record the way a surgeon removes a tumor, because her existence threatened the legitimacy of institutions that still wielded power long after slavery's legal death. Even now, in the 21st century, her name remains obscure, absent from most history textbooks, unknown to the millions who study the Civil War era without ever hearing about the 12-year-old girl who waged her own quiet war against intellectual oppression. There are no statues of Eliza Davis, no schools bear her name, no holidays commemorate her brief blazing life. And perhaps that is fitting because Eliza never sought monuments. She sought only the freedom to exist fully in her own mind, to read and learn and think without permission from those who believed themselves her natural superiors. Her legacy is not carved in stone, but carried in the DNA of every person who refuses to let others define the limits of their potential, every child who reads by flashlight under blankets after bedtime, every mind that insists on its own sovereignty against systems designed to crush it. She is the patron saint of all the brilliant ones who were never supposed to be, who existed anyway, who proved the lie by simply refusing to disappear. On winter nights in Philadelphia, when snow falls silent over the streets where Eliza once walked, some say you can still feel her presence in the archives and libraries, in the whisper of turning pages and the scratch of pens across paper. It is a foolish notion, perhaps a romantic fiction, to comfort those who wish the dead could witness their delayed vindication. But there is a deeper truth in the myth. Eliza Davis did not need to become a ghost to haunt America. She haunts it every time a black child's intelligence is questioned, every time brilliance is mistaken for threat, every time potential is sacrificed on the altar of comfortable lies. She haunts it in the genetic research that has definitively disproven the racial hierarchies men like Morton spent lifetimes constructing. She haunts it in the PhDs and scientists and scholars who carry her defiance in their very existence, proof that genius recognizes no racial boundary. The men who examined her are dust now, their theories discredited, their names remembered only as architects of pseudo-scientific horror. But Eliza endures, not in statues or textbooks, but in the quiet knowledge passed between those who understand what she represented. She was not an anomaly. She was a revelation of what had always been possible, what had always been true beneath the manufactured hierarchies and cruel mythologies. She was 12 years old, enslaved, and more brilliant than the men who claimed ownership of truth itself. And though they killed her body and tried to erase her memory, though they buried her twice in soil and silence, she outlived them all. Because you cannot kill an idea whose time has come, and Eliza Davis was an idea made flesh, that no chain can bind a sovereign mind, that intelligence is rebellion, that one girl's genius can indict an entire civilization. Let her name be spoken. Let it be remembered not with sadness, but with the fierce pride of knowing that she walked this earth, that she proved what needed proving, and that somewhere tonight another brilliant child is teaching themselves by candlelight, carrying forward the unfinished revolution Eliza began. Her story does not end. It echoes forever.